Scripture reference for this evening is Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2. In our nightly calls, we take an interesting format of applying a historical story to a biblical principle. The hope is to make sure that we understand the biblical principle by making a real-life application and also sharing a little history or something that makes the biblical principle easy to understand and memorable. Sometimes those stories are serious, sometimes they're interesting, and sometimes they're just left to the individual imagination. And tonight I have a fun, interesting story to share, but a more important biblical principle to apply. Today is August 4th, and it is also the 5-year anniversary of a Twitter message that went out, and I want to read the message to you. For those who are not familiar with Twitter, Twitter is just a means of communicating a written message by people who decide to follow you, and they can see messages that you send. It's kind of like text messaging. So on August 4th, 2015, a Twitter message went out, and I'm going to read the message to you and give you the backdrop behind the message, and of course an application of the more important biblical principle. The message reads as follows. After careful thought, thoughtful consideration, and considerable squabbling, we have made the difficult decision to terminate our romantic relationship. We will continue to work together on television and in all media now known or hereafter devised in perpetuity throughout the universe. However, our personal lives are now distinct and separate, and we will be seeing other people, pigs, frogs, etc. This is our only comment on this private matter, unless we get the right offer. Thank you for your understanding. If you notice that I said pigs and frogs and etc., that was not a misstatement, it was an intentional statement. This was a Twitter message sent 5 years ago by Miss Piggy in regards to her relationship with Kermit the Frog. It was announced that they were separating permanently after having been together for some 40 years. If you know anything about the Muppet television show, you know that Miss Piggy was crazy about Kermit the Frog. So crazy that even at one time, she had a minister to trick Kermit into signing a marriage license. All in fun and simply a matter of television. Jim Henson, the creator of the Muppets, did a great job in making those puppet characters come to life. And the Muppet Show was on TV as a sketch comedy from 1976 to 1981. If you're wondering why that tweet that I read was sent out, it was sent out in the fall of, or the summer, late summer of 2015 as a publicity stunt. The owners of the Muppets, Disney, wanted to advertise their fall program. When we consider that message, there were 3 things to remember, and that is the message was written by a company, it was written for marketing purpose, and it was written to impact an audience. The Jim Henson Muppets were sold and is owned by the Disney company. So certainly the Disney company or their advertising agency was behind the Twitter message. And they had a marketing purpose, again, to advertise the television show, which was being revamped that fall. The message, again, was to impact the audience so that those who heard it would be alerted, would find interest in it, and would tune in. While we take humor in considering the Muppets, and we are saddened by the separation of Miss Piggy and Kermit the Frog, we are reminded that, in a matter of speaking, that we are like a puppet, and that is, we should allow God to pull the strings and orchestrate the movement of our lives. The Bible declares in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse number 2 that Jesus is the author and finisher of our faith. When we consider the Muppets, there is a writer, there's a team who manipulates the storyline and directs the purpose and the plans of the Muppets. In such a manner, in the same manner, we ought to allow Jesus to simply orchestrate every aspect of our lives. Remember that the message was written by a company, written for a purpose, and written to have an impact. Consider this idea in Jesus being the author and finisher of our faith, that our lives, our faith, our experience, our journey should be written by Jesus. Just as the Muppets are owned by a company, we are owned by heaven. The Bible teaches us in Philippians 3 and 20 that our citizenship is in heaven. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse number 19, the Bible declares that we are not our own, for we are bought with a price. The fact that God owns us gives him a right to write the story of our lives. Second, our story, like the puppets on the Muppet Show, is written for a purpose. We must understand that God has a purpose for each and every one of us. That's why the Bible declares in Psalm 37, in verse number 23, that the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord. Most of our unhappiness, our unfulfilled experiences, our regret from bad choices is because we did not allow Jesus to manipulate us as puppets and to accomplish his purpose. We set out to do things, to achieve things for our own purpose, only to later conclude that we do not have the knowledge or wisdom to know how to direct our own steps. In addition, we must also recognize that as the author and finisher of our faith, he not only writes our faith and directs us as citizens of heaven whose steps are ordered by the Lord, but our lives are written so that we can have an impact on others. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13, the Bible declares that we are the salt of the earth. One must wonder what is meant by the idea of being the salt of the earth. Salt had three purposes in historical accounts of studying salt. We come to understand that at a time when there were no refrigerators and food needed to be taken care of, salt was applied to do three things. Number one, it had to penetrate the food. Number two, it purified the food. And number three, it preserved it. As the salt of the earth, God has not put us here for the purpose of looking good or absorbing more fresh air. We're not here to seek our will. We're not here to accomplish any purpose other than that of the God of heaven, who again is the author and finisher of our faith. It is the expectation of God that we will go out into this sin-filled world, penetrate the world, purify it by our example and by our teaching, and preserve it by our demonstration of Christian character. Many believers, unfortunately, focus on politics in an effort to make the world better. God is looking for believers to be the salt of the earth. It is not our job to align with Republicans or Democrats. Certainly we have a responsibility to vote. But our job is to make Republicans and Democrats align with Christian values. It is most unfortunate when you hear Christian commentators on the radio who frequently chastise you and almost diminish your authentic Christianity if you do not align with a political candidate or a political party. Usually, this is based on some single isolated issue, a hot button issue like abortion or capital punishment or the LGBTQ agenda, immigration, or something along those lines. We must understand that this was the problem with Israel and what got them in trouble when they entered into the promised land. They wanted to be like the world around them instead of being the salt of the earth and penetrating the world, purifying the world, and preserving the world. If we truly understand what it means for Jesus to be the author and finisher of our faith, we can then appreciate the idea that we are puppets and that God pulls the strings. He pulls the strings because he wants Jesus to write and recognize us as his citizens in his kingdom, and as such, he also has a purpose for us in ordering our steps and in hopes that we can make an impact on others. This was the purpose of the statement given by Miss Piggy on this date in 2015, and it is the enduring, perpetual responsibility of the church to follow this plan and to recognize that we are God's puppets used for his purpose. This has been another edition of A Few Minutes with the Minister with Words from the Master.